All right, this is solving absolute value equations, and this is video 6 for Algebra 1. So for absolute value, we need to remember that you always have two answers. Absolute value is kind of like the distance. Okay, so if you think of the absolute value of what is 3, well, on a number line, what two numbers are 3 spaces away from 0? Okay, and that would be 3 and -3. Okay, so I like to think of absolute value as kind of a distance, and that really helps me when solving these problems. There's a couple things that we need to remember when we solve these, is there will always be two answers, always. It is a very rare occasion that the two answers are the same number, but technically you still have two answers, okay? And absolute values cannot equal a negative number, and that kind of goes back to the distance thing. You can't have a negative distance. You can have a distance in a different direction, but it's never negative, okay? So here are our steps for solving, okay? And these are kind of our basic steps that will help us whenever we're solving any sort of absolute value problem, okay? So the first thing is move any outside numbers across the equal sign by inverse operations. That would be if I had my absolute value and then I had +7 or times 3. Those would be considered those outside numbers, okay? And we'll get into that here in a little bit. The next part is separate into two equations. So we're going to get rid of our absolute value signs and make it into just two regular old equations. Okay, so if we have two equations, we solve for two answers, and then always you can check your answers just to make sure that you are correct. Okay, so we're just going to hop in here we've got 4 examples today. All right, so for this first one, I don't have any outside numbers here. There's no multiplication number here in the front besides 1. I'm not adding or subtracting anything off to the sides, okay? So now we split this into two equations. We get rid of the absolute value bars, and everything in there stays the same. We just change to equaling 16 and equaling -16. Okay, so those are what our two equations are now going to equal. I like to just focus on one equation at a time and solve that. Okay, so if I ignore this second, I just solve this like normal. I subtract 1 from each side. 5x equals 15, and after I divide by 5, I get that x equals 3. Okay, and so there I can clearly see, yeah, x equals 3. Now I can go ahead and solve my second equation. Now I'm dealing with a -16, so my answer might be a little bit different. So I'm going to subtract 1, and I get 5x equaling -17. And when I divide by 5, that's not even, so we're just going to keep it as an improper fraction. And these are our two answers. Okay, 3 and -17/5. Now when I check my answer, I can plug this back into my original equation and see if I get 16. So 5 times 3 is 15 plus 1. The absolute value of that would be 16. Okay, if I plug in -17 over 5, that times 5 would just be -17, plus 1 would be -16, and then the absolute value of that would be 16. All right. Our next example, here's an example where we've got an outside number. So I want to get my absolute value all by itself. So what we need to first do is subtract our 5. And then I've got my absolute value equaling -3. So now I can go ahead and solve this. But it'll save us some time if we realize that this is negative, okay? Earlier we said absolute value can't equal a negative number. So this actually has no solution. You can write out no solution, or you could write that circle with a line through it. Those mean the same thing. All right. Our next example here, we've got an outside number that's being multiplied. So I'm going to divide by 2. And I've got the absolute value of x minus 4 equaling to 8. Now I can split this up into 2 equations. I always like to draw these arrows so I remember to make both of those equations. All right, now this is a easy one-step equation. So once we get rid of those absolute value bars, our solving becomes pretty easy. All right, so we've got -4 and 12. All right, our last one, this is about as complicated as these problems will get when we've got something multiplying and adding. This could be subtracting, it could be dividing, whatever. But just do your inverse operations. So first we're going to subtract our 4. And then we can divide by 3. And this actually is quite clean. There's no weird fractions or anything. So I've got the absolute value of x plus 10, or x plus 7 equaling 10. And now I can split this into my 2 equations. So x plus 7 equals 10, and x plus 7 equals -10. Okay, again, I've got a one-step equation. Subtract 7 on both sides, x equals 3. And if we subtract 7 over here, we get x equals -17. All right, and those are our easy steps for solving absolute value equations. Thanks.